So,
Come over here.
what's your take on Roundup? And just to give a bit of context here, Carmen and Christian run Urban Farm School here, and that's super cool. But Carmen you've been forestry, you worked as a commercial greenhouse grower.
Yeah.
Tell me a little bit tell these guys about your background.
So basically, I have a degree in forestry, and I've worked for the Alberta government for many years, and also privately, but mostly in the field of forestry, sustainable land management, soils, and silviculture, as well as a pretty good long-term stint in aerial photography, doing species inventory for the province of Alberta. So, but all around sustainable land management. Yeah.
Okay, so I'm doing a couple of videos on, I don't know how many it's going to turn into, but on this thing right here. And what a better opportunity to talk about it than with somebody that's been involved in biology and ecology for a long time, much longer than I have. And so, yeah, tell me your thoughts on herbicides in general.
Well, we've never used, in the 27 years I've been on this property, there's never been a touch of any chemical product on my property. I just really, personally, I never saw the use of it, never saw the purpose for it, because I always trusted that nature knows what it's doing. And so we have to ask ourselves, why do we need to create an enemy that we call a weed? Like, what is it in our nature that wants us to take the pendulum swing from nature is benevolent to nature is evil, right? And why do we vilify certain plant species to the point where we want to poison our entire ecosystem with a product such as Roundup? I really don't get that. So I think it's our absolute need for control that predicates us to creating these kind of products. So it's not something I'm familiar with using because I've never used it. So it might be easy for me to take that opposite view and be at the far spectrum of the pendulum swing. So not knowing enough about what the motivation is behind the use of Roundup, I mean, I don't like it. I don't see the use for it. That sounds very simplistic. I can hear myself talking and it just sounds ridiculous, but I think as long as we have this need to control natural systems, and that's largely a function of us not understanding natural systems, then we're going to be drawn to something like this.
So, just a sec, Christian. So, that's awesome, and I want to introduce Christian actually, because Christian's a software engineer, and every time I come over here, we end up having a conversation about shadow work and psychology and
UFOs.
Self-awareness.
Most things that he talks about are just totally over my head, because he's thought about these things a lot more than I have. But I'm curious, given that you're a student of Freud and
Jung.
What's your take on it? Like, I mean, I think Carmen summarized it pretty quickly. Control.
Well, I have a couple of takes on Roundup. Not necessarily the product itself, but the reasons for the use. And one of the things I've learned about permaculture is that when you have insects ravaging a field or a crop, or it doesn't matter on what scale it is, there's something wrong with that crop, right? And insects generally do not cast their blight, so to speak, or start eating up crops that are perfectly healthy. They're there to help you weed out the bad plants and make the entire gene pool more healthy. So when you're it's
I know, it's okay.
This is a pretty common belief system these days. And the interesting thing is that we react with fear rather than saying, hey, maybe there's something wrong with our soil, right? Which is the basic health. It's like gut health in a human being. It runs everything else, the brain, everything else. So the gut health of a plant, from what I understand, is soil health. And if you don't have good soil health, you're going to have insects come and basically start to bother your crops. So instead of reacting in terms of fixing the soil, we react in terms of killing the insects. and then we create all kinds more of issues with chemicals and chemical resistance. And my other thought process about Roundup basically is, why make an issue like insects
Or weeds.
or
primarily
weeds
is what-
worse than it already is? How does that help the situation? How can you throw a fix like Roundup at a natural problem and make it worse?
Or is it even a problem?
Well, and that's
Exactly,
kind of my
yeah.
take as well,
Yeah,
is that it's
that-
not really a problem.
It's not a problem. It's an adjustment.
Right, nature trying to
Right?
balance itself out.
But humans
yeah.
cast these things as quote unquote problems,
Right.
but they're not problems. You
Except
just
I think that it's really important, and because I can see where these types of videos can really alienate people, because
Yeah.
there's people that make their livelihood as a
Absolutely.
result of this. Like
totally.
when I look at this,
I have family that does.
Yeah.
totally, and I mean, when you're dealing with 1,000 acres, 160 acres, whatever, anything, a property that's not this size but much bigger, we can't, or those individuals cannot afford to pay labor to individually go out and pick plants that are
Right.
going to damage combines.
Absolutely.
Right.
And then it's very easy for us as urbanites to sit on our high horse and expect cheap food,
Right.
and then say, well, we want cheap food and we don't want you to use this stuff in order to get it. But
Right.
this is basically liquid labor.
Yes, it is liquid labor.
Yeah.
And I think one of the uses for Roundup that most people don't know about is not only is it used for as a herbicide to, obviously largely in monocultural systems, to sort of weed out undesirable plants or non-conformist plants in a system, but also used to desiccate a crop at the end of its cycle so that the harvest can continue all within a specific period of time. So
Right.
it used to be that they would use Roundup as a herbicide, but then on top of that, but at that time they didn't actually use it as a desiccant. So they were just using it for herbicidal control.
But forestry as well.
Not,
right?
Not
They're-
so much.
Yeah, but they're touting this as a solution to forest fires.
Right. But
It's not.
But I think what we're finding now, which really exacerbates a lot of our gut issues today, and also a lot of our health issues throughout most of the population, actually, is that Roundup is being used as a desiccant at the end of the season. Every single bloody monoculture crop is being sprayed at the end of the season to desiccate it all at once so that they can get the crop off in one day, or
Right.
2 days, or whatever. That means that whether there's a herbicide issue or not, right, whether there are quote unquote weeds coming into your canola crop or into your corn field or whatever, regardless of that, this is being applied. So every single crop is getting a massive application of Roundup.
Yeah, and so there's this huge
That's a big deal.
disconnect. It's like we were talking about this earlier, about how something could be GMO free,
Right.
but still have.
Absolutely.
And if you think about the soil, you kind of hit on this a little bit, Christian, but the soil, a friend of mine once said this to me when I was very, very early in my permaculture career. He said the soil is basically an open air intestine,
Right. Exactly.
which is like, it's the microbiome.
Absolutely. It's
And,
a microbiome.
and if it's screwing up the soil, it's absolutely going to screw it. And now the science is like catching up to this. And
Absolutely. Well, in my soil health classes, I always teach that just as we understand how important, microbes are to our soil, to our gut health, that if we understand the importance thereby of the soil microbiome, and that if we're not honoring that microbiome in the soil, then we can't get the nutrient uptake into our plants, which means that we are not eating not only nutrient-dense plants, but we are also eating microbially deficient plants. So it makes me really wonder, how are we supporting these gut problems were they just weren't around years ago. So we are now growing food that is microbially dead and nutritionally deficient. So every vegetable that we eat is now basically dead food.
not to mention, this stuff's water soluble.
Right.
So
Exactly.
it's going up through the tap roots.
That's right.
So last night we were all at Sunnyside with the Permaculture Calgary Guild, and I don't know if you guys had the same experience as me, but at least 3 different people talked about people that were either in the hospital or terminal,
Wow.
Yeah.
and all of them had cancer.
Wow. Yeah.
And this is becoming, it's like now 1 in 2 people
Right.
are
1 in
having
2
this
people.
stuff. So
Absolutely.
we're about to get some rain. We're going to move inside and keep this conversation going.
That's right.
The next thing I want to talk about, though, when we move in, is coming back to that, sitting on our high horse and like, what's the
Right.
solution?
Right.
Because it's easy to talk about the problems.
Sounds good.
So we're going to move inside and fill ourselves back up with wine and keep this convo going.
One of the things that struck Carmen and I 4 or 5 years ago was that everywhere on Facebook, and you still see it, it was fight Monsanto, fight Monsanto, fight Monsanto, fight Monsanto. And I said to Carmen one day, I said, why is it always fight Monsanto? Why is it always fight PNH? Why is it always fight? Like when they talk about cancer, what's the word they use with cancer? You have to fight cancer.
It's the enemy.
But cancer's already within you.
Mm.
It's one of your cells that has been altered to be non-functional and in fact to be very, very detrimental to your system, right? So I have a closeted, airy-fairy and very unlikely belief that if anyone could show Monsanto how to make just as much money by making natural versions.
So they're kind of doing that. And so, like I've often said, we start these PDCs off with
Right.
the spectrum sort.
Yeah,
And
which
almost
is really awesome.
always, pretty much every time people say, well, we shouldn't throw GMO out because it might be useful.
It has been.
And it might be.
It has been for
It might
60
be, but
years.
that's not enough.
But like imagine if we just use our ability to genetically engineer to understand species a little bit more effectively.
Yeah.
So we start these courses out with spectrum sort, and people say, well, we shouldn't throw it out because maybe the technology will be useful, and I absolutely agree with that. And I agree with your statement about not fighting Monsanto. I made a video about this today, and said like, look, we know enough now that we can start making choices for ourselves, and it's easy for us to point our fingers at this and say this is the only issue, but we're consciously buying the food covered in it.
Exactly.
We're consciously using it on our properties.
Right.
We are sending signals to our farmers that we want cheap food. Like, we can't just blame one thing. It's like our
Well, more to the point, we have 7 billion people walking this planet,
yeah.
right? And we not only have to feed them all, but we have to. The big corporations, as you can vilify them all you want, but they have to worry about lawsuits. Torts have made everyone incredibly fearful over the last 20 years.
Except, which is why I'm surprised it's still being sold, actually.
I know.
Right.
Well, they
But-
just had another massive judgment against them,
But
like a $5 billion judgment.
the whole feeding the world, though, is a fallacy. I mean, you look at how how monocultures work and how ineffective they actually allow soil to photosynthesize. I mean, we're taking a
Right.
6-month growing window for grass in this ecosystem, and we're shortening it down to a month and a half.
Right.
We're touching on climate change, we're touching on food security, we're touching on
Absolutely.
biodiversity, microbiome, it touches everything.
Right.
And so let's bring it back now to, we'll put the microphone on top of the Roundup, because then it looks like it's got a little hat there.
Poetic.
That's right. It is poetic.
So let's bring it back to the solutions, because it's easy for us here as urbanites, in this urban permaculture oasis to villainize Roundup and to villainize the people that use it, which is really not our intention.
No.
No.
We were just talking about how some of the best farms that we know of are still energy negative. They
That's
take
right.
more energy to run them than they do. So
Yeah.
it's not a sane strategy to just say, well, we're going to
Right.
stop using this tomorrow because we'll probably all starve.
Right. And realistically, Roundup is just another tool at farmers' disposal. And actually, it's probably our current predicament has been, brought into this, large scale use because there have been no viable options. And do those answers exist today? Maybe not.
And-
What I love about the permaculture paradigm is that we can explore various options, and there's lots of people doing really fantastic large-scale food production that doesn't actually require the use of Roundup, but it's risky for a lot of farmers, and I mean they're in it, lock, stock, and barrel, and the investment that they have in their property and their equipment, and I mean the whole monoculture system is really why Roundup is being used. So I mean we have to address that system before we can address this one, almost.
But let's also talk about energy over time. So we glibly talk about how much energy something takes to do something, but we have to look at 70, 80 years ago, or 90 years ago, before tractors were invented, right? It was all manpower, right? You had a horse, and you fed the horse, and the horse pulled the plow, or the oxen pulled the plow. Then we created tractors, and they ran on steam, which cost nothing. Then we created tractors that ran on gasoline. The price of gasoline went up, right? So it's energy over time. It's not just energy, it's energy over time. How have things changed over the last 80 years, right? So when you boil things down to either torts and lawsuits or the price of gasoline or diesel, right? And you use that as the standard by which to judge everything else that's going on, I totally get it, but it's not, you have to factor in the time, the last 80, 90 years of how farming has evolved.
Maybe, but I think like when I was looking at the numbers just a couple of days ago, I mean, it's a very simple calculation. It's kilocalories in, kilocalories out. We measure our food in kilocalories.
Right.
I know, but what I'm saying is with the advent of the oil and gas industry and the mechanical machinery that's sprung up around it, that changed everything. Transportation, it changed air travel, it changed farming.
Of course.
Yeah.
So that has to be factored in. I agree, it's very important, but you also have to take into account that it's not necessarily a good standard by which to judge success or failure. Maybe you have no choice.
Well, I mean, for me, it's a very simple physics calculation, and
Yeah, I agree with that.
When you Trump just about bombed Iran a couple of weeks ago, right?
Yeah.
And so
It was never going to happen.
fine, but I mean, regardless, but there are, whether it's Trump or a suicide bomber or somebody, the minute you shut down the Strait of Hormuz or any of those oil-producing regions,
A lot of assholes pucker up.
and
The price goes up.
and all of a sudden it's like we're like when we start talking about the energetics, and I'm talking specifically about the energy in versus energy out of food.
I agree.
You've got a serious black swan on your
Absolutely.
and really like what we came back to at the beginning was this is liquid labor.
Yeah.
And so I don't think we can really understand the cost of kale as an example
absolutely.
when you take this out of the system.
Right.
And especially up here in the northern climes where we've got the ability to grow for 100 frost-free days.
Right.
So let's come back to the solutions again, and I think, naively or not, it might be totally naive to expect this, but when I look at the productivity happening out there, and there's still even some spaces that are used for kind of, we'll call it communal spaces.
Right.
You guys aren't running tractors, you're not spraying herbicides. I mean, it's basically whatever your labor is in going into this is the energy source, and then you're harvesting your rainwater. Everything's kind of managed by human power here.
That's what I'm talking about.
My gut is that I bet you that it's a positive.
Yes.
It's positive coming out. We'd have to do the calculation, but
right.
Depends on how you value things.
Well, it depends on what you grow as
no,
well.
because a BTU is a BTU and a calorie is a calorie.
Right.
Okay, what I'm saying is we want people to buy, we advocate people to buy organic food because of the nutrient value in it, correct? And I've been in the grocery store many times, and I had this little old lady a couple of years ago look at me, she goes, is organic food worth the price? I'm like, well, I don't know. How much do you value yourself? How much money do you have? Those are two questions that are actually diametrically opposed to each other. Are you worth it? And is it so expensive that you can't afford it? So when you place your value levels in different places, right? So let's say you insert yourself into the current conceptualizations of energy, and you say, well, I'm going to spend this energy to do this and this, and those are all very valid. However, what are the value of those things on the back end, right? People with actual nutritional fruit and vegetables in their bodies and require less medical care, right?
Totally.
Or people who want organic so badly that they are forcing their local grocery stores to say, sorry, we're only buying organic. And if you're GMO or you're chemical based, fuck you, we don't want any part of it. So you have to drive the system almost from the back end, but you also have to look at value, not just in terms of money or in terms of fuel spent to do this, but you have to put things in their place. Maybe the fuel spent to do this is more than worth what you get on the back end.
But
That's
again-
all I'm saying.
but again-
I mean, let's change our value systems a little bit.
Totally.
Right.
I mean, you can come at this from so many different angles, but
Yeah.
I think what I'm trying to coax out of this conversation is that without this tool, agriculture and food production has to scale down.
Right.
And
Absolutely.
more people
Without a
have to
doubt.
be involved in it. Like
Without a doubt.
we
Yeah,
get a lot of anxiety about the cost of food going up, and all the social justice warriors come out and start talking about it. But in reality, price is just a signal.
Right.
And the minute that food actually becomes unattainable with Canadian dollars, let's say, more people are going to grow food.
Absolutely. Without a doubt.
Yeah, it may take a revolution.
Absolutely. But that's why, I don't know, I love the idea of what I'm doing with Urban Farm School, because I get to show people or reintroduce young people to this romantic idea about what it feels like to grow their own food and provide for their own family. And that's a very cool thing. And if that's what it takes, if romance is the gateway to get people to grow something in their backyard, I'm okay with that. Just
Totally.
getting them going, right?
Yep.
But
And she's
yeah,
the romance queen.
no, I mean, you're right. I mean, there's no doubt about it that this has allowed food to be produced cheaply, even though the cost of the farmer is incredible, not only for the product, getting the product in their fields, but also the embodied energy and all the equipment. But in addition to that, the cost of soil health down the road is like devastating. And it's something that, thankfully soil is pretty resilient and we can bounce back from that if we get the right strategies in place in time. But this is basically a drug, right?
Yeah.
It's a symptomatic product
Very good. Yeah.
to treat
It's
an
an
issue that
it's a-
needs to be
Yeah.
dealt with at the root cause. And
It's an aspirin for a headache.
Except that it
That's all
kills
it
the
is.
roots, guys.
it kills the roots. It does.
Wow.
It kills the roots. So yeah, it's a very interesting questions that you ask us, and also it's like you said, it's very easy to sit on a high horse and be judgmental of the current system. I'm not sure that really solves anything. I think the best way is for small scale producers, for us to vote with our dollars in the way that we spend our food, not just organic, because that's really, when one really understands current soil health, that's just not enough.
No.
But also, just supporting the smaller operations that don't really require the use of this kind of a product because they're not growing large scale monocultures. That alone is a huge shift. But it's a big system.
I had a conversation with John Steinman, who wrote a book, and I just want to hold on that because I want to. The sun came in. I want to try. So, John Steinman was at one of the conferences that I just attended, and do you guys ever listen to the radio show Deconstructing Dinner?
No,
It was I cannot remember what radio.
it's like a good show though.
Oh yeah, it's great. You can get all the back episodes.
I'll write that down.
And he wrote a book called Grocery Story, and it was essentially how groceries essentially are a social pact with your community, and that he's been a really big part in the Nelson Food Cooperative.
Okay, cool.
And so the grocery store is owned by the people that buy the groceries.
Yeah.
to remove the conflict of interest. Because when you get into a for-profit grocery situation, the objectives are pretty clear. It's like, well, they're in business to make money,
To serve themselves.
which is fine. We live in a market economy, and the profit motive could be a very powerful mechanism to make things happen. And I'm an entrepreneur, and I'm interested in making a livelihood for myself, doing things that I believe in. But he raised some really interesting comments, and it's just really interesting how it's like and probably stems right back to the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, or maybe just Henry Ford, I don't know. But as we've created silos, it's allowed us to become more specialized. And I mean, this is essentially just a very clear expression of specialization.
Yeah.
Right.
And now we're at this situation, we're realizing that the result of that specialization is coming at the expense of our health, and even, I mean, what's the average farmer is 65 years old, 3% left. 3% of our population or less is actually farming right now, which is, again, liquid labor. And so how do we, so the average person, what do they do? What's the solution here? We've talked a little bit about growing some food. That's potentially a solution for a segment of society, but
Right.
what else is open to the average person that actually wants to make a shift?
Right. So in my mind, it means really supporting local producers and small scale local producers. I don't think there's any other way to send a viable message. I mean, we can get out there and protest all we want, but the reality is that that's not really where the power lies. The power lies with the people. It is the people who vote with their dollars.
Yeah, they have to be educated, between the different, in terms of the differences of organic versus non-organic.
Yeah, but even that is not enough anymore.
Yeah, but it's a piece of the puzzle.
Right.
It definitely has to be there.
I want to talk a little bit about the letter you just wrote.
Yeah,
that story.
I wrote a letter to the Minister of Agriculture here in Canada. I cannot remember her name. I'm sorry. She's part of the Trudeau government that I respect, and I was appalled when I read that the Canadian Department of Agriculture had approved use of Roundup for another 15 years. Even though it was completely banned in the European Union. And I thought, what are we missing here? I mean, if I'm using toothpaste from a certain brand, and I read in a couple of places that it might be hurtful to what I start doing research, and I think, well, is this safe? My health is important. So I have been doing the research for years, and so I finally wrote a letter to the minister, and I'm a bit incendiary at times, but the basic question I asked her honor, was how much Roundup in a glass of water would you allow your child to drink? Like how many parts per million or thousand
Would be acceptable.
would be acceptable, would you allow your child to drink, even though General Mills and a couple of other large cereal companies have been found to have Roundup and other products of its like found in trace elements in
Trace amounts,
almost the entire spectrum of cereals that people feed their kids. So the response I got back was, well, we did some testing and they found no. I'm sorry, I'd have to have the letter in front of me, but they said they found no conclusive proof that Roundup was dangerous to human beings. So it wasn't enough that the European Union had completely banned Roundup, and a number of other countries outside the Union had banned Roundup in its use. They needed much more conclusive proof than that.
Wow.
Like if 15 of my best friends said, don't drink this water out of this bottle because it has, E. coli in it, I think my general reaction would be, okay. Well, I'm going to put safety first, and I won't drink this.
Right.
It's not a difficult concept.
But also, I think Roundup is one of those things where the majority of consumers don't don't think about what's on their food when they go to the grocery store. And unfortunately, whether it's looking at a catalog that comes in your newspaper or a flyer or whatever, or going to the grocery store where everything is displayed so lovely and it all looks, healthy, green, eat your vegetables kind of display. That's what most people want to see, right? They're not connecting. What I'm trying to say is that
They're in their comfort zone.
if the farmers, if they were required over top of this beautiful display of broccoli or onions or not mushrooms, but peppers, sweet peppers, or tomatoes, to display what chemicals were used in the growing of this food.
Right.
Do you think that people would make the choice easily between organic and
Imagine if Cheerios had glyphosate in the ingredient deck.
Exactly. So if they were required, like every other packaged food, you're required to list the ingredients. But if vegetables, if they were required to disclose that,
Right.
Yeah,
it would be a total game changer.
So feedback is what you're saying. There's no feedback.
There's no
why
feedback.
why do organic producers have to certify themselves as organic?
Right.
But people who use products based on herbicides and pesticides don't have to
divulge.
It's like
don't have to divulge at all.
It's like the Alberta building permit, or the Alberta building code. That building code basically legislates the shittiest building we're allowed to build.
Yeah.
So
That's
everything
the
is
minimum.
like, exactly. And so we actually force the best to disclose,
Right.
and the lowest
to not disclose.
to not disclose. It's really interesting.
Yeah, it is very interesting.
And then you get this like false sense of security as a consumer. It's like, well, the government approved it, but you don't really know what their approval process is or what their metrics of
Absolutely.
success is.
And the usually the higher end homes with the best building materials and the lowest E-rate are somewhat more expensive, right? So people will always opt for the cheaper, or at least they'll opt for the lower sticker price. When in the long run, the home that was built with energy efficiency in mind, even though it's more expensive, 15 years down the road will be much cheaper to operate.
So that speaks to me again about this whole utility attitude we have towards food. Why do we think that cheaper is better? Is it just about economy, or is it kind of like we don't how is it that we don't value food more? What is it in our psyche that we've transitioned from food being the most important thing for you to live each and every day, right? And if you didn't have it and you went a long period of time without it, you'd die, right? So you wanted to know, that was like people spent their entire lives just pursuing food, right?
Well, that was all you
think
lived
about the
for.
Middle Ages. And so how have we transitioned into this point now where we totally undervalue food? Why do we think cheaper is better?
Because we don't
Why
have to
is
grow it
that?
ourselves anymore.
Right, but I mean, it used to be that if you had a choice between food that was obviously contaminated and food that wasn't, you would choose the food that wasn't, right? Because you
Logically.
valued your life,
And
right? Your life
that's feedback
depended
that's
on
not
it.
coming in.
Exactly.
Lobby groups.
That is such. So one of the next videos I'm going to do is I'm going to actually go to Safeway. I'm going to buy a bunch of non-organic food, and I'm going to buy a bunch of organic food. They're going to look the same almost, but right now, primarily, the value proposition that differentiates the two options is price.
Right.
There's a small label on there, but the thing is that price is not a suitable
It's not.
Yeah.
differentiator between these two pieces.
It is not.
Because one is poisonous,
And one is
one's
not.
Imagine if you go to the grocery store, it's like you can buy poisonous kale for $3 a bunch, or you can buy just regular kind of probably okay kale. It's not being grown with herbicides and pesticides, and it's $5.
Right.
No one would choose like even like on this label. There's no poison thing on
I
there.
know, which is absolutely unbelievable.
And even on the City of Calgary herbicide things, there was just it said warning, but there was no skull and crossbones
Right.
on the label that they were
Yeah.
telling people, don't go out for 18 hours and touch any of this, either dogs or humans.
But what if somebody walks onto that park and they miss the sign?
Right. Which is this big, by the way.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, it's
It's just
it's
insane.
bizarre.
It's absolutely crazy.
Very bizarre.
So we're gonna have dinner here right away. I can smell the torch here in the oven, which is smelling amazing
Smelling
right
good.
now. And
broccoli
this
is
is definitely not a conversation that's over. I'm going to be going around and making a whole bunch of videos with this bottle right here as I go around and try and inform people with regards to how Roundup is touching pretty much everything from forestry products all the way down to food products and everything in between, as well as the urban lawn and the urban landscape. It's not an easy issue. There's so much wrapped up in here. It's easy for us to, as we said earlier, to stand on our high horse and say that we don't want it. But there's all sorts of consequences to eliminating it from agroecology and landscape and everything else. So I encourage you guys to leave comments in the comment section below. And if there's anything specific that you want to talk about or want us to talk about with regards to Roundup, let us know. And we will see you guys in the next video, unless you guys have any other
Nope,
comments.
we're good.
No, can't wait for the next one.
All right. Talk to you guys soon.